Here's something nobody tells you when you're stuck. That feeling you're waiting for, the motivation, the confidence, the readiness, that moment when everything clicks and you finally feel like you can move, it's never coming. Not first. Not before you act. That feeling doesn't precede action. It follows it. And every day you wait for it is a day you hand over your creative power to a chemical signal that was never designed to work the way you think it works. Let me say that more directly. You are not unmotivated. You are not broken. You are not lacking discipline. You are running the sequence backward. You're waiting for the engine to warm up before you turn the key. But the engine warms up because you turn the key. And I'm not saying that as a motivational platitude. I'm saying it because there's a specific neurological mechanism behind it, and once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. It changes how you approach your mornings, your sales calls, your creative work, your entire relationship with productivity. So let's get into it. Most people carry around a mental model of motivation that goes something like this. First, I need to feel inspired or ready or energized, then I take action, and then I get results. Feeling first, action second. It sounds reasonable. It matches our subjective experience. When we remember our best moments of productivity, we remember feeling good. We remember being in a state of flow, so we assume the feeling caused the flow. We think the state created the output. This is one of the most expensive misunderstandings a human being can have, because it turns you into a passenger in your own life. You become someone who's constantly scanning their internal weather report. Do I feel like it today? Am I in the zone? Is this the right moment? And here's the brutal part. Some days you do feel it and you perform well, and it reinforces the belief. It creates a feedback loop that feels true, but it's a trap, because the days you don't feel it, you don't act, and those days add up, they compound, and 6 months later, you're wondering why nothing has changed. Let me give you a specific version of this that I see constantly because I've lived it. A salesperson wakes up on Monday. They had a rough weekend. Maybe a client ghosted them. Maybe they lost a deal they thought was locked in. They sit down at their desk and think, I need to get my head right before I start calling. So they check emails for an hour. They reorganize their CRM. They scroll through LinkedIn looking for inspiration. They read an article about closing techniques, and by 11:30 they still haven't made a single call, not because they're lazy, but because they're waiting for a feeling of readiness that has not arrived, and at this rate never will. Now contrast that with what the highest performing people actually do. They don't feel ready either. That's the part that shocks people. The top performers aren't operating from some permanent state of confidence and clarity. They've just learned through repetition that the feeling comes after the first 10 minutes of work, not before. They pick up the phone feeling flat, feeling uncertain, feeling nothing, and they dial anyway. And somewhere around the third or fourth call, something shifts. Their voice gets sharper. Their questions get better. They start reading the client more accurately. They're in it. The feeling arrived, but it arrived because they moved. So here is the core judgment I want you to carry out of this video, and I mean really carry it, not just agree with it. Action is not the result of the right feeling. Action is the generator of the right feeling. The sequence is reversed from what almost everyone assumes. You move first. The state follows. Now let me show you why this is true at the level of your brain, because I don't want you to take this on faith. I want you to understand the machinery. There's a structure in your brain called the dopaminergic system. Most people have heard of dopamine, and they think it's the reward chemical, the thing that makes you feel good when you achieve something. That's partially true, but it's deeply misleading. Dopamine's primary function is not reward, it's anticipation, it's prediction. Dopamine fires most intensely not when you get the reward, but when you predict a reward is possible. This is crucial. Your brain doesn't give you energy after success. It gives you energy when it detects a cue that success might be coming. So what happens when you sit at your desk waiting to feel motivated? Nothing fires. There's no cue. There's no movement. Your dopamine system is basically idle. You're sitting in a cold engine, wondering why there's no heat. But the moment you start acting, even badly, even reluctantly, your brain begins to detect patterns. It says, oh, we're doing this now. There may be a reward here. And dopamine begins to flow, not because you succeeded, but because you signal to your own prediction system that something is happening worth paying attention to. There's a second mechanism that matters here, and it's called the reticular activating system, or RAS. This is essentially a filter in your brainstem that decides what gets through to your conscious awareness and what gets discarded. Your brain is receiving millions of bits of information every second. The RAS decides which ones matter. And here's the key. The RAS prioritizes what you're actively engaged with. When you're sitting still, waiting, scanning your feelings, your RAS has no target. It lets in noise, worries, doubts, random thoughts, that inner monologue that says, maybe this isn't the right path, maybe I should try something else. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. But the moment you engage in a specific task, making a call, writing a paragraph, opening a code editor, drafting a proposal, your RAS locks on. It starts filtering for relevance. Suddenly your brain is oriented. It's pulling in useful information and suppressing the noise. This is why people report that once they start working, the anxiety fades. It's not willpower overcoming anxiety. It's a neurological filter activating because you gave it a target. And there's a third layer here that connects directly to creativity and flow. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying creative people, scientists, artists, entrepreneurs, musicians, and one of his most important findings was this. Flow states are not something you find, they are something you construct. Flow requires a clear task, a challenge that matches your skill level, and immediate feedback. None of those conditions exist when you're sitting around waiting to feel inspired. They only exist when you've started. Flow is downstream of action. Always. Here's what's even more interesting from Csikszentmihalyi's research. He found that creative people don't describe their best work as coming from moments of sudden inspiration. They describe it as coming from sustained engagement with a problem. The painter doesn't wait for a vision. She starts putting paint on canvas, and the vision emerges through the interaction between her hand, the medium, and her developing judgment. The scientist doesn't wait for a hypothesis to feel right. He starts running experiments, and the hypothesis sharpens through the data. Creativity is not a lightning bolt from the sky. It's a feedback loop between action and perception. And the loop cannot start without the action. Now let me lift this up to a higher level, because this isn't just about productivity tips. This connects to an entire framework for how you build a life. Naval Ravikant talks about something that most people gloss over because it sounds too simple. He says, inspiration is perishable, act on it immediately. Most people hear that and think, sure, don't procrastinate. But that's the surface reading. The deeper reading is this: inspiration is not a permanent state you can store. It's a transient neurological event. It's a brief alignment between your attention, your dopamine system, and a possible future. And if you don't act on it within a narrow window, it dissipates. Not because you lost interest, but because your brain's prediction system reclassifies it. It moves from possible reward to hypothetical scenario to thing I once thought about. The chemical urgency is gone. And you can't get it back by thinking about it harder. This is why Naval also emphasizes that the most important decisions in life are not about choosing the perfect option. They're about speed of action on directionally correct choices. He doesn't say, be reckless. He says, stop waiting for certainty. Because certainty is what your brain produces after you've already started and gathered enough feedback to calibrate. You don't get certainty before the action. You get it during. Charlie Munger adds another dimension to this. Munger talks about the psychology of misjudgment and one of his 25 cognitive biases is what he calls doubt avoidance tendency. When the brain faces uncertainty, it has a strong drive to resolve that uncertainty quickly, often by making a snap decision, or, more relevantly for this conversation, by avoiding the situation entirely. When you sit around waiting to feel ready, you're not being thoughtful. You're engaging in doubt avoidance. You're letting your brain's discomfort with uncertainty masquerade as strategic patience, but it's not patience. It's paralysis with a respectable narrative. Munger also talks about inversion, solving problems backward. If you invert the question, how do I get motivated? You get what would guarantee I stay unmotivated. And the answer is obvious: do nothing. Wait, analyze endlessly, seek more information before acting, plan without executing. These are the guaranteed paths to staying stuck. So if you invert those, the prescription becomes clear. Act before you're ready. Execute before the plan is perfect. Move before the feeling arrives. There's a concept from the Talmudic tradition that maps onto this as well. In Jewish commercial ethics, there's a principle that knowledge only becomes real when it enters exchange and action. A scholar who studies Torah but never teaches, never applies, never engages with the community, that knowledge is considered incomplete. It's not fully alive. The same principle applies here. Your ideas, your skills, your value, they don't exist in any meaningful sense until you put them into the world, until you act on them, until you offer them to someone. The action isn't just the expression of the knowledge. The action completes the knowledge. Before action, it's theory. After action, it's understanding. And this is where it connects to something I think about constantly in my own work. Selling is not separate from growing. Selling is growing made visible. When I build something, whether it's a tool, a framework, a piece of analysis, it doesn't become real until I put it in front of someone who can use it, until I explain it, until I watch them react, until I hear their objections, until I adapt. That process, the selling process, is where the growth happens, not in the private refinement, not in the endless preparation. The preparation is necessary, but it's not sufficient. The growth happens in the friction between your offering and the real world. Now let me connect this to how you actually build the capacity to act without feeling ready, because understanding the theory isn't enough. You need to understand the training. And as Ericsson's research on deliberate practice gives us the mechanics, deliberate practice is not just repetition. It's structured repetition at the edge of your ability, with immediate feedback and targeted correction. The key word there is edge. You're supposed to feel uncomfortable. You're supposed to feel not ready. That's literally the signal that you're in the zone where growth happens. If you wait until you feel comfortable, you've already moved back into your existing skill level. You're rehearsing what you know, not building what you don't. So the feeling of not being ready isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's the indicator that you're positioned at the boundary where improvement is possible. When a salesperson picks up the phone and feels nervous, that nervousness is a signal. It means they're about to engage with a situation that requires more than their current automatic responses can handle. That's the growth opportunity. The moment they feel smooth and easy and confident on every call, they've probably stopped growing. They're coasting on accumulated skill, which is fine for maintenance, but it's not where new capability comes from. Here's how to practice this in a way that actually builds the neural pathway. And I say neural pathway deliberately, because what you're doing when you act before you feel ready is building a new default. Right now, your default is feel uncertain, pause, analyze, wait. You want to replace that with feel uncertain, begin, calibrate on the fly. That's a different neural circuit. And like any circuit, it strengthens through repetition and weakens through disuse. Start with what I call the 5-minute override. Here's the rule. When you notice yourself waiting for a feeling before you start a task, set a timer for 5 minutes and begin, not with the intention of finishing, not with the intention of doing it well, just with the intention of doing it at all. After 5 minutes, you can stop if you want, but here's what you'll discover: almost every time you won't stop. Because by minute 3 or 4, your dopamine system has engaged, your RAS has locked onto the task, and the resistance has dropped. You didn't overcome the resistance. You outlasted it. You ran the clock on it. And that's a fundamentally different strategy than trying to psych yourself up. The second practice is what I call the pre-feeling audit. At the end of each day, look back at the moments where you hesitated. Write down what you were waiting to feel. Then write down what actually happened when you started anyway. Over time, you'll build an evidence log that proves to your own brain that the feeling follows the action. This isn't positive thinking. It's empirical self-observation. You're collecting data on your own motivation system, and data changes beliefs faster than affirmation does. The third practice is specifically for people who sell, and remember, I define that broadly. If you sell products, services, ideas, yourself in interviews, your vision to a team, this applies. Before every significant interaction, stop asking yourself, do I feel ready? And start asking, what's the first useful question I can ask this person? Shift your focus from your internal state to the other person's situation. This does 2 things neurologically. First, it activates your mirror neuron system, which orients your brain toward empathy and social prediction rather than self-monitoring and anxiety. Second, it gives your prefrontal cortex something productive to do instead of running anxious simulations. You can't be anxious and genuinely curious at the same time. They compete for the same cognitive resources. Curiosity wins if you give it a target. Let me give you a real scenario that makes this concrete, because I don't want this to stay abstract. Imagine someone, let's call her Myra, who's been building a consulting practice. She's skilled, she's knowledgeable. She's spent months developing her frameworks, refining her positioning, building her website, but she hasn't reached out to a single potential client. Not one. When you ask her why, she says, "I'm not ready yet. I need to refine my pitch. I need a better case study. I need to feel more confident about my pricing." Here's what's actually happening. Myra's amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, has flagged outreach as a social risk. Rejection, judgment, exposure. These are real threats as far as the amygdala is concerned, and her brain has generated a perfectly rational-sounding story to justify avoidance. I need to be more prepared. That story feels like wisdom. It feels like professionalism, but it's fear wearing the costume of strategy. Now here's what happens if Myra sends one email today, just one, not to her dream client, to someone she knows slightly. Something simple. "I've been developing a framework around X. Would you be open to a 20-minute conversation so I can get your perspective?" That email changes everything, not because it's going to land a contract, but because it activates a cascade. First, her dopamine system registers that she's in motion toward a goal. Energy increases. Second, her RAS starts filtering for relevant information. She starts noticing articles, conversations, opportunities that relate to her outreach. Third, the person might respond. And that response, whether it's positive or skeptical or even silent, is feedback. Real feedback. Not the imaginary feedback she's been generating in her head for months. And feedback is the raw material of deliberate practice. Without it, you cannot improve. You can only imagine improving, which is not the same thing. Now multiply that by weeks and months. Myra sends 5 emails a week. She has 10 conversations a month. Some go nowhere. Some lead to follow-ups. 1 or 2 turn into paid work. But more importantly, her understanding of what she's actually offering, what language resonates, what problems people really have, what they're willing to pay for, that understanding deepens in ways that would have been impossible from behind her desk. She's not just selling, she's learning, she's calibrating, she's building her ability to read a room, handle objections, and position her value accurately. These are skills that only develop in contact with reality. And here's the part that connects back to the deeper philosophy. Myra's knowledge didn't become real until she put it into exchange. Before the outreach, she had theory. After the outreach, she had understanding. The selling wasn't separate from the expertise. The selling was the final stage of the expertise developing. I want to address one more layer of this because I think it's where most people get quietly stuck, and nobody talks about it. There's a specific form of waiting that disguises itself as ambition. It sounds like this. I want to do something big. I don't want to start small. I don't want to waste my effort on something that isn't at the level I'm capable of. This is a particularly dangerous form of waiting because it feels like it's coming from high standards. It feels like quality control, but it's actually a form of what psychologists call self-handicapping. By refusing to start until the conditions match your vision, you protect yourself from the possibility of discovering that your current skills don't match your vision. You preserve the fantasy of your potential by never testing it. Naval has a phrase for this. Desire is a contract you make with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want. When you're fixated on the gap between where you are and where you want to be, you're in a state of chronic dissatisfaction that paradoxically makes you less likely to act. Because every action you could take feels inadequate compared to the vision. So you wait, and the gap grows wider because the world doesn't wait with you. The antidote is not lowering your standards. It's separating your identity from your current output. Your current output is a data point, not a verdict. It's where you are, not who you are. The best creative people in Csikszentmihalyi's research understood this intuitively. They didn't describe their daily work against their ultimate vision. They judged it against yesterday's work. Am I slightly better than I was? Did I learn something I didn't know? Did I make a mistake I can correct? That's the relevant comparison. Not am I where I want to be, but am I moving? And this maps directly onto something I've noticed in my own work with sales training systems. The salespeople who improve fastest are not the ones who set the biggest targets. They're the ones who do the most granular daily reviews. They don't ask, did I close the deal? They ask, did I ask a better question than yesterday? Did I listen longer before responding? Did I identify the real objection instead of the surface objection? These are micro improvements. They're almost invisible day to day, but they compound. And compounding is the most powerful force in human development, just as it is in finance. This is Munger's mental model of compounding applied to personal growth. Small, consistent improvements, compounded over time, produce results that are wildly disproportionate to the effort of any single day. But the compounding only works if you show up. Every day you wait for the feeling before you act, you break the compounding chain, you reset to zero, and you cannot make up for lost compounding. That's the mathematical truth that makes waiting so expensive. Let me bring this to a point that I think is especially relevant for anyone navigating this era. And by this era, I mean a time when artificial intelligence is reshaping every industry, when the stability of a single career path is no longer guaranteed, when the ability to sell yourself, your ideas, your unique combination of skills is not optional but essential. In this environment, the people who wait to feel ready are going to be displaced by people who act while learning, not recklessly, not without thought, but with the understanding that the feedback you get from action is infinitely more valuable than the comfort you get from preparation. The person who ships an imperfect product and iterates based on real user feedback will outperform the person who polishes in isolation every time. Not because quality doesn't matter, but because quality without contact with reality is just a guess about what quality means. This is true in sales, it's true in engineering, it's true in content creation, it's true in building relationships. The people who reach out, who start conversations, who make offers, who put their thinking in front of others, they build networks. They build reputation. They build the kind of specific knowledge that Naval talks about, knowledge that comes from doing, not from studying. Knowledge that can't be trained because it's the product of your unique experience applied to real situations. And that kind of knowledge is the foundation of everything that compounds wealth, influence, trust, capability. So let me be very direct about what you should do differently starting today. First, identify the one task you've been postponing because you don't feel ready. You know which one it is. You've been circling it for days or weeks. Today, give it 5 minutes, not 5 hours. 5 minutes, start and see what happens. Second, tonight before you sleep, write down 3 things you did today that moved you forward, even slightly, not 3 things you wished you'd done. 3 things you actually did. This isn't journaling for therapy, it's evidence collection. You're training your brain to recognize progress instead of scanning for failure. And what your brain recognizes, it reinforces. Third, tomorrow, before your most important task, ask yourself this question. What would I do right now if I knew the feeling would come after I started? Then do that thing. Don't wait for the answer to feel true. Act as if it's true and let the experience teach you. Fourth, if you sell anything, a product, a service, an idea, yourself, make one outreach this week to someone who operates at a level above your current comfort zone. Not to close a deal, to start a conversation, to ask a question, to learn. Position yourself where your value can be seen by people who understand it. That is not arrogance, it is accuracy. And it is the only way your capability matches your ambition. Fifth, stop measuring your days by how you felt during them. Start measuring them by what you produced and what you learned. Feelings are weather, output is climate. You don't judge a city by one rainy afternoon. Don't judge your trajectory by one difficult Monday. I want to leave you with something that I've come to believe very deeply, not because I read it somewhere, but because I've tested it against my own experience as someone who builds, who sells, who creates, who struggles with the same resistance everyone does. Confidence is not a feeling you find. It's a byproduct of repeated action taken without confidence. The people who look confident didn't start that way. They started uncertain and acted anyway, and the action generated evidence, and the evidence generated belief, and the belief became the thing we call confidence. But at every stage, the action came first, always first, so stop waiting to feel ready. The readiness is not coming to rescue you. You rescue yourself by moving. And the moving, imperfect, uncertain, uncomfortable, that is where everything you want actually lives. The real question has never been, am I ready? The real question is, am I willing to begin before I am? Because the action is the feeling. It always was. If this shifted something in how you think, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd follow along or share this with someone who needs to hear it. And drop your thoughts below. I read every comment. Here are 1 questions I'd love to hear your take on. What's the one task you've been avoiding because you're not ready? And what would happen if you gave it 5 minutes right now?